So where are we going to go in this discussion? Basically, I'm going to spend some time talking about the philosophical and theoretical orientations of the model. I'm a geek by nature. My hobby is teaching at a graduate school in their counseling program. So I like to geek out to things like paradigms and philosophies and theories and models. But beyond that, I think it's actually really important. I think that if you can understand the assumptions upon which something is built, you have a better grasp of that thing itself and whether or not it is a good fit for you, whether or not you trust it, believe it, that kind of thing. So I'm going to spend a good deal of time on those philosophical and theoretical orientations. And how's that for a confusing graphic? What I'm trying to communicate there are 5 interlocking rings. Okay, there's these 4 on the outside. There's this one right here in the middle. So what these represent are 4 different theories or fields of study. Okay, these theories or fields of study that I draw from. I draw from all 4 of these. There's a lot of overlap between them. There's a lot of synergy between them, but they are 4 independent fields of study. And then right here in the middle is one principle or idea that is the pin that holds them all together in this model. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to walk through these 4 fields of study or 4 theories and the one idea or principle that holds them together. So the 4 fields are adult attachment theory, developmental neurobiology, affect regulation theory, and relational cultural theory. And then that principle that holds them all together is something called values-based self-activation. So we're gonna go through those one by one, and we're gonna start with adult attachment theory. When I was early in my own recovery process, I believe it was before. Yeah, it was. It was before I ever started down the professional road of getting trained clinically. My therapist actually mentioned a book that was an academic book, not necessarily written for lay people who are not professionals in the mental health field, but I think it's a great read for anybody, and it's called Addiction as an Attachment Disorder by Philip Flores. Addiction as an Attachment Disorder. I read that book probably around 2010, I would guess, and it was like a lightning bolt struck me, because all of a sudden something that I intuitively felt in my own experience, something that actually resonated with me from my perspective of faith. I'm a Christian, and that's a very important thing to me. This really resonates, even though it's not a Christian book. I have no idea what Philip Flores's spirituality is, but it just matched both my experience and my worldview and my belief system about humans and relationships and addiction. And so I became an absolute nerd about attachment theory. And so here's the high view of what we're talking about with attachment theory. First of all, is the principle that humans are wired to survive and develop in secure attachment relationships. Secure attachment relationships. Okay. Survive and develop. So in other words, we are created for connection. We now know that literally the human brain and its optimal development is based in part upon the experience of these secure attachment relationships. So the caregiver to the child, the security felt in that bond, the sense of connection there, it literally stimulates the growth of the brain. Okay, which now we're getting into that overlap with developmental neurobiology, which we'll talk about in a minute. But attachment theory says that connection, that these attachment relationships, they're not secondary needs. See, before John Bowlby, who's the father of attachment theory, before he came along and began articulating these ideas, it was thought that the reason why an infant pair bonds to the mother is because the mother provides food, nourishment. Okay, and so therefore the connection to the mother is secondary based on the primary need for food. Well, basically, through a bunch of research, that's not true. The connection itself, the secure attachment itself, is a primary need. Because of that, here's the second bullet point there. Even the perceived threat to our primary relationships, whether secure or insecure, whether those relationships or experiences secure or insecure, when we perceive them to be threatened, we process that as an issue of primal survival and as being traumatic. So if I walk into my house and I pick up on something in my wife's tone of voice or her facial expression that says we're not okay, I have a spike, right? I go upward into like a hyper aroused state. I move toward fight or flight or freeze or flop or fawn or one of those threat responses when I think a relationship is not okay. Okay. It's wired into us. That's why when a kid like my daughter, 3 years old, she's running around outside, she trips and falls, she's hurt, she immediately calls for mama or daddy, right? Because it's wired into us that the loss of the relationship is a threat, but when there's a threat, the presence of the relationship, so the reverse is true as well, can be a source of comfort and protection. But what happens is these early relational experiences that we have become organized as patterns of relating, serving as templates for how we do relationships. So we all have what is called attachment styles. Attachment styles. And this is a non-conscious sort of template that we are walking around with all through life. And as I interpret what's happening in relationships, I'm interpreting it through the lens of this template, whether it's a secure attachment style, preoccupied, dismissive, fearful, avoidant, disorganized, which we're not going to have time to get into all the particulars of those today. Excuse me, is warming up in my office. But we all have an attachment style. So what that means practically is that when I feel threat, I'm gonna lean more on that template and what I expect to happen in the relationship than my actual attention to what is happening right here, right now in this relationship. And it has the result of me automating my partner and myself. I go into this automatic mode where I'm just following this script of how I think things are going to go. And those are rooted in these early attachment experiences. Sum all that up. What the big headline for the couples in a recovery model is from attachment theory is that feeling safe and secure in the relationship is a vital need for you and your partner. When we don't feel safe and secure in the relationship, we are going to react one way or another. We are going to be in a state of threat, or we're going to avoid. We're going to do a flight response, which is itself based in a state of threat. Okay, it's just a little more subtle, a little harder to get in touch with. So that's one of the first theories that informs my model. Okay, the second is developmental neurobiology here, if you want to geek out, and I'll put his name here. Alan Shore is a researcher who he's probably my favorite living neurobiological researcher today. That I know that's geeky. My geek's really coming out a lot today, but I'm talking about my favorite thing. So one of my favorite things. So developmental neurobiology is really looking at the development of the brain and the nervous system throughout the body, through the lifespan, but particularly in these very formative windows of development, infancy into early childhood. There's also during adolescence a window in which we're particularly open to formation. But here's what's important for us from developmental neurobiology. Early attachment experiences have an effect on the development of our social emotional capacities. So the nervous system of an infant literally is not able to regulate itself. An infant literally cannot self-soothe. So when a 2-month-old, 3-month-old, 4-month-old baby is left alone to self-soothe, they're not actually self-soothing. they cry and cry and cry until they fall into collapse, okay, which is a whole separate threat response. They're shutting down to prepare to die, okay. These children need an external nervous system to come in and regulate them. And as that external nervous system regulates their nervous system, soothing them, mirroring them, comforting them, it begins to scaffold their own capacity. It builds out their ability to eventually do that regulation work themselves. All right. So now at 3 years old, my daughter, there's a degree of, hey, you can do it. You can take a deep breath. You know, she still may take some coaching and some prompting from me, but she's figuring it out, right? She's not just, it's more than just figuring it out. She's gaining the capacity. So we learn to take care of ourselves and others by being taken care of. And so if in our childhood, we experienced abuse or a lot of neglect, if we didn't have those secure attachment relationships where a caregiver was mirroring us, pouring into us, helping us learn the healthy ways to regulate our emotions, if we didn't get that, we probably don't have that capacity because it has to be downloaded into us from the outside. It's not just going to come from nowhere. Also from developmental neurobiology, implicit memory connects relational experiences and neurophysiological states of functioning. Okay, what does that mean? All right, so we all have this implicit memory system, non-conscious, automatic, very, very fast. It's what we've experienced over and over and over again. Think of it kind of like muscle memory. Muscle memory is a form of implicit memory. Okay, so what happens is our relational experiences, what's happening in the relationship through the implicit memory system is connected to neurophysiological states of functioning. So in other words, neurophysiological states of functioning means what's the state of my body? What's the state of my emotional state, my affective state, what's happening? And then that has an effect on what's happening in my mind, right? And so what's happening out here in the relationship through implicit memory and association and repetition can trigger within me a certain neurophysiological state, which means, here's my, bring it down to earth. We function in relationships based on old scripts. So old ways. I know how this goes. I know how this fight happens, or I know what happens next, but that's usually non-conscious. Okay. It's usually non-conscious. Okay. So I've got a line here. Watch out for 50-cent reactions to nickel problems. When you have a 50-cent reaction to a nickel problem, all right, when you overreact to something, there's probably an implicit memory that's been activated, and it's activating within you this felt state of the body, this neurophysiological state that's then going to result in all sorts of cognitive processing. All right. And there's it's really a trauma response is the bottom line. I just shared the slides again because several of you have come in. You should be able to download those now. And if you can't, when this replay is ready, we'll send you all an email that has access to these slides. And then lastly, from developmental neurobiology, many relationship struggles are rooted in developmental deficits rather than defense mechanisms. It's so important to recognize the difference between a defense mechanism and a deficit. A defense mechanism, I could do this thing, but I don't. I choose not to. It may not be like a conscious active choice, but there's this moving away from it, all right, out of fear or pain, fear, pain or whatever, versus a deficit. A deficit means I don't have the capacity. A very powerful example of this is when I work with addicts who don't have the capacity for shame regulation. And so when they go into shame, they sink down, they collapse, and they're stuck there until it finally plays out. Finally, hours later, maybe a day, maybe days later, they finally come up out of it because they don't they literally don't have the capacity to come out of it in that moment. It wasn't built into them from early on. Okay. So from this, what I believe is that we are better off focusing on growing ability, on expanding capacity, not highlighting inability. I do not like, I do not like when people think that shame is going to move people out of shame. They shame people for their shame response. What's wrong with you? Can't you see she's just trying to share her heart? What are you, not man enough to hear it? I mean, like if the guy's really already in shame, that ain't going to help. We don't shame people into healing. Just harping on what people can't do, that is not going to help. What I'd rather do is get a couple in these chairs right behind me, and this happens, like I really do this in those two chairs, right? And I walk someone right to the edge of their capacity. Let's continue with the example of shame resilience, right to the edge, and actually into the experience of shame, and then we do the work to actually scaffold their capacity and build out their capacity to overcome the shame. That is transformative work. That is transformative work. And so there's no shaming here. Someone sent me a question privately that I see. What if you have a nickel reaction to a 50-cent problem? And I've seen people do that. I've seen those addicted partners and betrayed partners both do that. And that is probably a trauma reaction as well, where it's like, too threatening to actually have that right size response. You've learned to not have your voice or whatever. And so what are we going to do? We're going to walk you to the edge, and we're going to help you expand that capacity. We're going to push you to have the experience that is actually constructive literally in your nervous system, constructive in terms of your own abilities.